It has come to my attention that Admirable Animations has had a bit of a limited scope. I took a look at every single episode that I've done, and I realized that I have never done an Admirable animation of anything before the 1990s. I mean, if you want to get really technical, I do consider my discontinued eras of animation of the very first animations of all time an honorary Admirable animation, but the oldest thing that officially has the title of an Admirable animation review, I think, is the Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, which came out in 1993. This wasn't intentional in any way. The most prime candidates for Admirable animations are cartoons that I was really into growing up, or am really into now. At the start, it was just about telling people of these cool cartoons that I really liked, or ones that I thought were interesting. But obviously, there's way more to animation history than I've lived in my life, and I thought that it'd be really cool if I could take peeks at certain points of the past. And when it comes to animation, you can't go much further into the past than with Winsor Mccay. Also, I'm really desperate for a video that I can be confident won't get copyright tagged. Who is Winsor Mccay? He was an amazing artist and one of the most important animators who ever lived. To put things into perspective, many people today are inspired by the works of Walt Disney. Winsor Mccay was the guy who inspired Walt Disney. While he wasn't the guy who invented the medium, as he did claim, that title goes to Emil Cohn, someone I talked about in the Eras of Animation video, there's an argument that he was the person who popularized it. Winsor Mccay was born around the late 1870s as Zenas Winsor Mccay to Janet Mccay and Robert Mccay. And going into his early life history, it's interesting to see how the story of the artist has stood the test of time. From a very young age, he had artistic talent. According to a story Mccay himself once told, one day, after a fire had hit his hometown of Spring Lake, he picked up a nail and etched the scene into a window pane. Many people had said that his level of detail and accuracy was spectacular. He was naturally talented, and able to draw things from memory, and even things that he had never seen before. It became obsessive for him. "I just couldn't stop drawing anything and everything," he said. However, his father didn't think that he could make a viable career as an artist and sent him to a business school. Yes, really. The more things change, the more that they stay the same, I guess. He went to Cleary Business College in... I cannot pronounce this word. Ypsilanti. Ypsilanti. Cilantro. Okay. Ypsilanti. He went to business school in Ypsilanti, Michigan. However, he didn't much care about classes, as he would brag about catching the train at midday and drawing portraits at a dime museum. This eventually gained him some notoriety. A man named John Goodison taught Mccay privately and taught him things like using observation to draw in geometrical perspective. A lot of his early history involves learning from a wide variety of people, learning new techniques from various mediums, and learning of great artists of the past. I can't go into too much detail here, as this is supposed to be a video about his work and not exactly his life in general. He was working at a newspaper called the Cincinnati Enquirer when he did what most people tend to know him for, Little Nemo, a comic strip that ran from 1903 to 1911. Little Nemo is genuinely one of my favorite comic strips of all time. In fact, I like it so much that I bought a book of newspaper reproductions. The only problem is that the book is so big and heavy that I literally can't put it on any shelves or it'll warp the material that make them. Seriously, look at how big this fucking book is. I want to say right off the bat though, the artwork in these comics is just gorgeous. And you have to remember that this was a weekly comic strip. They definitely showcase Mckay's technical abilities, probably more than anything else that he's ever done. I don't think that that's all there is to it though, or the only reason that these comics were a success. The comic strip is about a boy who enters a vivid world of dreams every night, complete with mushroom forests, parades of exotic animals, mermaids, you name it. The most famous comic strip is one where Nemo's bed grows its legs, and just takes a walk through his home city. What is drawn enhances the comic as much as how well it's drawn. The plot of it is simple, at least in the first year of it or so. The Princess of Slumberland wants Nemo as a playmate, and every night, the king would task someone with bringing Nemo to Slumberland. However, Nemo would always wake up before he got there due to fear or just the dream ending, and his parents would scold him for the terrible crime of dreaming out loud. Yeah, expect the values of early 20th century in certain aspects of this comic. It's not near as bad in that regard as many other things of this era, largely because a lot of it takes place in a fantasy dream world, but do keep in mind that some of the values are going to be quite different than the values of today. Other than that though, I'd honestly recommend checking it out. The Little Nemo comic strip is in public domain, like something it seems to share a lot in common with Alice in Wonderland. That means not only can you read it, but you're free to use the stories, the characters, anything about it in any of your own works. I don't know why this isn't as popular a source material as Alice though. It's just as creative. The only things that I can think of that are based on Little Nemo is the 1989 animated movie, the video game spun off from it, and the music video for Runnin' Down a Dream. And the really ironic thing is that Little Nemo wasn't in the public domain when any of these came out. It's really untapped potential, and I'd love to see what artists could do with it today. But as you might have been able to tell, Little Nemo, the comic strip, is not an animation. Or was it? One day, McKay's son brought him home a flip book. Flipbooks still exist, right? If you don't remember what they are, flipbooks are a prototype of animation. You have a book, and every single page has a slightly different picture on it. When you drop the pages, it makes it appear to be moving. The problem is that, well, the audience has to do something. It's easy to screw up flipping the pages, especially if they get worn, and it's hard to present to an audience of more than one person. However, you combine that with this great new technology that came out fairly recently, the film projector. And what do you get? Well, you get Little Nemo, the animated cartoon. And no, that statement isn't a redundancy. At the time, comics like Little Nemo were referred to as cartoons. The film starts with Winsor Mccay making a wager to his friends that he can make his drawing pictures move. And they all think that it's the most hilarious thing ever. Just hilarious, like they've never heard a joke before in their lives. Watching silent films is the most intriguing of experiences to a modern eye. And so, Mccay draws some of his Little Nemo characters. He gives himself a month's time limit to make 4,000 pen drawings move, which is, I don't think that I've drawn 4,000 pictures in my entire life. That feat sounds insane. And keep in mind, we're in an age of computers and programs like Toon Boom to make things easier. This was way back before any animation technology besides pen and rice paper. Rotoscoping and animation cells did not exist at the time. The Little Nemo film shows pretty much how it's done. One desk, a lot of paper, and a lot of ink. And then, at 8 minutes into this film, the pictures start moving. Honestly, this is pretty impressive visually today. I can only imagine how impressive it was in 1911, which is only a decade or two after film as a concept was even invented. When Thomas Edison made the film projector, he introduced it to an audience with a shot of a train coming at them, and people were so convinced by the illusion that they literally jumped out of the way. And I do believe that that reaction became the second film in existence. Or either that, it became the first missed opportunity in film history. You'd think that an animation of 4,000 drawings by one man in 1 month's time without technology would come out looking cheap or rudimentary. And while granted it's not the most fluid animation ever made, it's actually really good. While this isn't the first animation ever, as Winsor Mccay claimed in the introduction, it's generally noted as the first animation to have expressive character animation. Characters stretch and transform, chase each other, and have actual, character communicated through the animation alone, something that some people today have a hard time figuring out how to do. While working for various newspapers, Winsor Mccay decided to make a vaudeville act in his spare time. A vaudeville means variety show. He had Little Nemo, and a year later he would have his second film, How a Mosquito Operates, which there isn't much to say about. Sure, it's not in color like Little Nemo was, but it's still impressive. Not only is it longer, but I think the animation in and of itself is probably better than what was in Little Nemo, although, like I said, I don't have much to say about it. Both characters within are quite detailed. The most famous Winsor Mccay film, though, is probably Gertie the Dinosaur. If you've heard of anything that Mccay has done before this video, it was probably Gertie. Unfortunately, it's the hardest of his works to replicate through video alone. Gertie the Dinosaur was a part of this Vaudeville Act, and in a unique way. You see, Mccay would interact with Gertie in real time. In the present day, we have silent movie text boxes to tell us, but in an actual live show, he'd be talking as things happen. At one point, he'd even throw her a treat and she'd catch in the animation. And in the finale, Gertie would basically carry him away. Imagine Roger Rabbit, except you're actually there. Although I think that would be difficult to imagine in this more modern age. What still is just impressive in this day and age, though, is the technicals and what went into it. First of all, remember, no cell animation. This means that Winsor redrew the background for every single picture. The rocks and the tree and the lake again and again, along with Gertie. Pretty much all cartoons since the 1920s had drawn their backgrounds separately, and then animated the characters over it, with a translucent piece of paper, called a cell. In the 70s, they got really carried away with this, basically making certain parts of the character a part of the background. As someone gifted with the ability to stare at a wall for hours on end without getting bored, I can only imagine how mind-numbing this would have been. Mccay paid attention to even the most minute details. He timed his own breathing to Gertie's, and he took note of the ground sagging underneath Gertie's weight. He even consulted a history museum to make sure that Gertie's movements were accurate. Mccay's attention to detail was a gift that is rarely replicated, accounting for everything. Gertie tends to be noted as the first animated character that has a distinct personality. She's not just some generic dinosaur. She has a very childlike, troublemaking personality. Instead of listening to Mccay when she first enters the scene, she is more concerned with eating a tree and a rock. Sometimes she does tricks, and sometimes she doesn't listen or doesn't follow orders correctly. This is one of those things that any aspiring animator doesn't just watch, but they study, along with cartoons like What's Opera Doc or Steamboat Willie or Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It made it into the 50 Greatest Cartoons book for a reason. Also, this has a sea monster in it. Gertie the Dinosaur made quite the impact, inspiring more studios to fuse animation with live action, like Fleischer Studios' Out of the Inkwell or Disney's Alice Comedies, both series that I might get to in one of these historical episodes of Admirable Animation. It goes beyond that, though. Gertie the Dinosaur helped inspire a portion of Fantasia, which included dinosaurs like Gertie with careful attention to timing and weight. Mccay was working on a sequel in the early 20s that would have things like Gertie attempting to eat the Washington Monument. Unfortunately, it was never finished, and only exists in sketches and 1 minute of footage. It would have been really interesting to see and complete. However, for a while, the Vaudeville Act, with its unique and impressive animations, was going great. And then World War I happened. I'm not going to give you a history as to the long and complicated reasons to why that happened, obviously, but it's generally noted that the reason that the United States entered this war is because of the sinking of the RMS Lusitania, a British liner that was sunk by a torpedo shot from a German submarine. Almost 1,200 people were killed on the ship, 128 of them were Americans, and Mccay was enraged about this. Not helping was him being forced to illustrate anti-war cartoons for the newspaper he was working on at the time. In 1916, he went against his employer and began working on the sinking of the Lusitania, with his own time and his own money. Cell animations existed at this point, and this was the first film he had made using them. But even with that, it took almost 2 entire years to make. Little Nemo took 4,000 drawings. The sinking of the Lusitania took 25,000. He was really passionate about this, and it shows. The sinking of the Lusitania is generally noted as the first propaganda animation, and as such, the emotional atmosphere of this one really shows. For the first 2 minutes, we're given the backstory of the ship and the event, and then the torpedo hits and the ship explodes into a billow of smoke and destruction. We're told of some of the more notable casualties, and then the rest of the animation is just letting the ship sinking way into the audience. From animation and imagery, this is Mackay's most detailed work. The animation itself, I think, is the best that Mccay has ever done in his life. At times, it almost looks like a filming of the actual event, but the sinking of the ship was never even photographed. It goes out of its way to capture the tragedy of the event, the first time that anyone had ever attempted to do something like this with the medium of animation. It's hard to say which of these 3 shorts I've presented today is the most technically impressive, as pretty much everything he did was impressive in some way. I'd go with the sinking of the Lusitania though, at least from a modern perspective. The visual detail in this one is amazing, and the use of cell animation really helped him forward. Just the quality of the art is better than anything he had done before. And keep in mind, we're talking about an artist who constantly drew great looking things. However, this apparently was the straw that broke the camel's back with Mackay's newspaper boss. In February of 1917, his boss Hearst had Mccay give up vaudeville and all other work paid outside of the newspaper empire. In his mind, Mccay was letting his work suffer for his hobby. Mccay wouldn't be able to return to vaudeville until 1922, as he left the newspaper after his contract expired. He went back to his old job at the Herald Tribune and brought back Little Nemo. However, Nemo took a more passive role in the series and there was no continuity, and the comic wasn't popular with readers anymore. It's not all bad though. Because of the lack of success, Mccay was able to buy all copyrights of the strip, which the newspaper owned, for just $1. Of course, nowadays, because these comics are so old, they're all in the public domain, free for anyone's viewing or use. Other than that, though, this story doesn't have much of a happy ending. Much of Mackay's original artwork has been poorly preserved. He often insisted on having his original artwork returned to him, and a lot of it was destroyed in a fire in the late 30s. Much of it was sold by the family when they needed money, and Mccay himself destroyed many of his original film cans for more storage space. He made a few animated films in the 1920s, but mostly only fragments survive. As I've said, he inspired Walt Disney, but also Karl Barks, Robert Crumb, and Art Spiegelman, and many, many others, I'm sure. So his influence does live on in some way or another. But unfortunately, I think that the works of the man himself have been a little bit lost to time. The only time that I tend to hear about any of these works is in historical retrospectives, or things specifically dedicated to going over important animations. You don't see people making a bunch of different variations and adaptations on Little Nemo, like you see on Treasure Planet, Alice in Wonderland, or Wizard of Oz. You don't see Gertie referenced or appear like other public domain characters, like Paul Bunyan, for instance. Felix the Cat, I think, has appeared more often than Gertie. The only adaptation that I can think of came off of one of Mackay's works is the 1989 Little Nemo movie, which, once again, was made when the comic wasn't in public domain. It's a strange adaptation, too. It had a troubled production, and it really shows. The Nostalgia Critic did a review of it, and even his review cut out a lot of nothing that happened within the film. It's marred with strange decisions. I've watched it, and from what I've seen, it's a clear showcase of what happens when you try to make an adaptation too faithful to the original. Much of the comic, at least in the early days, was about Nemo trying to get to Slumberland, experiencing something fantastical or weird, and then waking up. You can't exactly do that in a movie, over and over again, which is what they try to do. There's also large segments of nothing plot-wise happening, because the comic didn't have much more than the bare basics of a plot until a certain point. It was just a tour of a fantasy dream world. It's not something that really works for a movie looking for massive appeal. You need to take it from where it is and change it up a bit. I have no idea what the hell the squirrel was about, though. That wasn't in the comics as far as I'm aware. I guess the point of the episodes that look this far back in the past is to help you get inspired. We look to the past to help us move into the future, and there are always little lessons that we can learn from everything. Good, bad, famous, or forgotten. Here we have one man with no technology who drew 4,000 drawings and made them move in 1 month's time. He was constantly self-improving, and he always looked to push the medium forward. The worlds that he created could have been imaginative, or they could have been somber. You don't need technology to do something impressive. All you need is a little bit of determination and an eye for possibilities.